But I'm also very sad that that story had been neglected.
The decision to go on war happens there, and you have to have a direct view of the forgotten or the dead or the people who have lost.
To what extent do Indian, Sikh, Pakistani Australians, to what extent do they feel that that place tells their stories as well? So the great challenge facing the War Memorial, in fact, it wasn't a fleeting encounter, it was a deeply personal encounter between a British officer and a sepoy, and they maintained contact until his death.
What's your message? How to find them, and how can we find more stories?
Keeping family papers in India is not easy, especially if you lived in the Punjab in around 1947, because if you were going to save yourself, you wouldn't necessarily save the box of papers.
Thank you, Professor Stanley, for coming over from Canberra and sharing the stories. The whole genesis, this conversation started 3 years ago when we met for the first time in Canberra, and I was highly amazed with the kind of work and research Professor Stanley has done. And I think for me, it's not just a history project, it's more of a legacy project for us. And that's why you can feel the enthusiasm whenever a Sikh family would reach out to you, and they will find you from everywhere. People have approached Professor Stanley from across the world, or from Sikh diaspora, and those interactions you're having, you can feel that enthusiasm. And I'm so thankful that you are open to interact with anybody who chooses to talk to you. From a point of view of those letters, Reginald, he wrote letters and he had mentions of Sikh fellow members at the campaign. Because writing a letter and mentioning people in the letter names is very much intimate, very much close, very much friendship. And that best of chums image amplifies that idea of, we were friends and we were working together. Could you narrate the story of the letters, and then can you talk about the letters and mentions?
Yeah, the Reginald you're mentioning is Reginald Savory, who was in that photograph surrounded by the veterans.
Yeah.
That's the one you mean?
Yes, very much. Yeah.
Reginald Savory was a very young and new British officer in the 14th Sikhs. I mentioned in the June attacks that almost all the British officers in the regiment were killed or wounded, and Savory was reported killed. So his parents got a telegram or a letter from the War Office saying, regret to advise, Reginald Savory killed on Gallipoli. So they went into mourning, and then they got a letter from Reginald, and they thought, that must have been posted just before he died. And he said, I'm not dead yet. He was alive. And he was alive because one of his men, whose name escapes me, but it's in the book, had rescued him, had picked him up out of the Turkish trench and carried his wounded body back to the aid station. And Reginald Savory survived, and he survived to become Chief of Staff of the Indian Army. The important point of the story is that, the family, of course, was overjoyed. So they cancelled the memorial service that they'd organised. Two things came out of that. The first was that it speaks to, as they say, the relationship between a British officer, a relatively new officer, I must say a very impressive young officer, and his men, that they carried him to safety. One of them carried him to safety. I'm struggling to remember the name, but it doesn't matter. The second point about the story is that Reginald Savory died in, I think, 1960-something, 50 years after Gallipoli. And his widow, after she told members of the family, I suppose, the first letter she wrote was to the... Would he sing? Anyway, the first letter she wrote was to the man who had saved Reginald's life 50 years before. So it wasn't a fleeting encounter, it was a deeply personal encounter between a British officer and a sepoy. And they maintained contact until his death. So it's easy to romanticize that relationship, but at the same time, it's impossible to deny it either. So I think that's the kind of story. There may not be other stories as profound, but I'm sure that there are a lot. You said I had letters from lots of people.
Yes.
I had another letter from the son of a British officer who had served on Gallipoli. Wimberley was his name, I think. And he had a photograph album, and it was full of photographs of his father, who was killed on Gallipoli. And when he was a young man, he went to India, and he met some men from his father's regiment, and they welcomed him as if he was his father. There was, it was a relationship that transcended generations. So, and I think that says a lot about the strength of family feeling in India. So that these stories are not unique, they're not unusual, they're just really hard to find.
On the stories, as in because you're spending so much time together, you are sharing food, you're sharing culture, you are interacting. I'm sure in that ledger you had of those key words, I think Sikhs are known to share, to teach. We learn each other's language through swear words probably, that they might be the first ones. But coming on the culture sharing of food, and could you talk about how we came together on food?
Yes, absolutely.
Because that's one of the things for us is our festivals are around food, our family gatherings are around food.
Yep. That's right. And anyone who goes to a Sikh Gurdwara is immediately struck by the generosity of the community. You don't just get welcomed, you get fed. Australians on Gallipoli, British and New Zealand troops, their diet, as you probably know, was bully beef, that's tinned beef, and hard biscuit. They didn't have bread, they had very, very hard biscuit. And they had jam. And that wears off. Nobody really wants to eat that stuff when it's 98 degrees in a trench full of flies. So what did they do? They would drop in on the Indian mountain batteries camps. And what were they offered? They were offered chapati, which is much more palatable than bully beef, I can tell you. They were offered, dal.
Yeah.
When they were offered a chapati, they were known to put jam on it. But the fact is, they were offered food. Food is, as you say, an important medium of exchange.
Yeah.
And it's not the only example. There are several examples like that. So I don't think it was an unusual situation. And eventually, of course, the Australians started to drop around to the Indian artillery camps specifically to pick up some chapatis. So yeah, it's one of the symbols of that friendship that we're talking about.
I want to add on the Sikh hawkers, the book written by Len Kenna and Crystal Jordan, and they talked about a lot of Sikh hawkers in Victoria, Queensland, New South Wales. And as they were traveling from one town to other town, and they will stay over the night in one town, and they will make a chapati, and they will add jam. So the kids will come around and he will tell stories.
Right.
And those chapati with jam on would colloquially called Johnny Cakes.
Is that right?
So the term Johnny Cakes was very prevalent with the young kids of those towns, of the villages, of the towns, that they go to school and talk about it. We had Johnny Cakes yesterday.
Yes.
It was roti and jam onto it. The marriage between the Indian culture and the Western.
Which means that the idea to put jam on it wasn't just originated on Gallipoli, that presumably Australians went to these camps and said, "Can I get some Johnny Cakes?" They knew what they were about to get.
Just to elaborate more on the idea of the forgotten. When we see in Canberra, the War Memorial and the Parliament are in the same line. And the intent there is that the Parliament, the decision to go on war happens there, and you have to have a direct view of the forgotten or the dead or the people who have lost. So that perspective of the forgotten and that decision-making done from the Parliament point of view or from the decision-makers versus people who go and fight the war. If you can bring that a perspective on the idea of the forgotten people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the ideal, Dev. We used to say when I worked at the War Memorial, we would often take visitors, dignitaries, to the pediment that looks between Parliament House and the War Memorial, and we would say exactly that. Sadly, Australia went and sent RAF aircraft to the Middle East without talking to the Parliament the other day, so it doesn't always work in practice. But you've raised the point about, if you like, who the War Memorial belongs to. Now, there's an Indian mountain gun in the Gallipoli Gallery. That's great. But my question is, to what extent do Indian, Sikh, Nepalese Australians, Pakistani Australians, to what extent do they feel that that place tells their stories as well? So what the great challenge facing the War Memorial, in fact all of us, for the future, is to ask ourselves, if Australian society is changing, as it clearly is, then doesn't that mean that we have to adapt our commemoration to change? Now that doesn't mean we commemorate the Anzacs any less, but we ought to extend the focus of commemoration to be those who fought alongside Australians. I'm talking about this in a lecture I'm giving in Adelaide next month, so I'm kind of practicing here. But that, I think, is, and this group is perfectly placed to consider that question, because my question to you is, do you feel included in Australian commemoration, or is it something that is basically an Anglo-Celtic celebration and you don't feel a part of it? Because if we are to live as Australians in an inclusive, pluralist society, I think we better change that. We better all feel a part of the annual rituals of commemoration, which are important. It's not just something we do every 25th of April. Well, we've got to do it because it's the 25th of April. We do it because it's important, and it should be important to all of us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's very deep and leaving thought. From a point of view of when we are interacting with families and trying to capture stories, one of your observation is you get a lot of enthusiastic families coming from Sikh background, but there are not too many enthusiastic families coming from whether it's Nepalese background or Musliman, Punjabi Muslim background. Yeah. I think there is intrinsically a bit more of the nature of that community embedded. But what's your observation there?
You're absolutely right. One of the values, one of the proud expressions of Sikh identity is that martial spirit. It's something that Sikhs have culturally, for very good reasons, given its history of persecution and conflict and going back to the 16th century. So of course Sikhs value martial distinction. And that's one reason why there are so many Sikhs here tonight. It's because military matters are something which is ordinary. It's accepted. You've got many of you here, hands up, have got forebears, ancestors who served in possibly the British Army, the British Indian Army. That is not the case. Despite the proud history of serving in the Gurkha regiments, and now serving in Gurkha regiments in the Indian Army, in the Nepalese Army, and in the British Army, Nepalese migrants to Australia don't seem to have the same identification. And I've been struggling with this for 13 years, 15 years, and I've never managed to crack it. I don't understand why Nepalese Australians aren't, if you like, more visibly proud of their heritage. I don't understand why Pakistani Muslims who have a heritage, well, no, I actually do understand this, why they're not also here celebrating, well, it's Eid, but why they're not here celebrating their military heritage to the same degree that we are here. And I think one of the reasons for the Pakistani case is that, as you know, armies award what are known as battle honours. So if you win the Battle of Waterloo, you get a battle honour on your flag. It says Waterloo, and you're very proud of it thereafter. The Indian Army also had battle honours. It had hundreds of battle honours. In 1967, I think it was, the Pakistan Army cancelled the British battle honours because it said, and understandably, these battle honours were mostly won by Indians fighting Indians, and we don't want that. Now, it was trying to set up an identity as a Muslim state, so it kind of went back to year zero, but it meant that the Pakistan Army isn't interested in the slightest in its pre-1947 heritage. So that kind of explains why Punjabi Muslims, as they call them, aren't more visibly interested in their history, because Pakistan is not interested in its pre-1947 military history. Mm-hmm. So those battle honours simply disappeared. The Indian Army keeps those battle honours, most of them. But it certainly keeps the titles of regiments, it keeps the identity, the badges of regiments that had pre-1947. So there's a completely different attitude to its history on each side of the border. And we've got to accept that, but I struggle against it because I want the same sort of Pakistani stories as I've got Sikh stories.
I also want to go back in history when the first moment when you thought you wanted to write this book. What was the trigger for you in that moment that when you decided that you felt that there is a gap of information? Yeah. What happened leading up to that moment?
Okay, I can tell you that. This hasn't been rehearsed. This is genuine. I know the exact moment because in 1980 I was a very, very young, what was I called? A clerk class 4 in the History and Publications section of the Australian War Memorial. And one of the things you could do in those days was go and help yourself to the records. So I did. And I found a memoir written by a man called Ferguson. I've forgotten his first name, but he was one of the officers of the Indian Mountain Artillery at Anzac. And he wrote a memoir of about 5,000 words describing the Indian mountain batteries experience on Gallipoli. And I thought to myself, I didn't know that. And I realized that there was an Indian army. I was already interested in the Indian army, but an Indian story and an Anzac story together. And I thought somebody should write something about this. Now, admittedly, it took another 35 years, but eventually I had the time and the resources, and the wherewithal and the oomph and the funding to go and write that story. The really sad thing is that nobody told that story in the meantime. That document has been there since 1925, and nobody had told that story until I came along, which, yeah, I'm quite proud of it, but I'm also very sad that that story had been neglected. So, and I'm sure it's not the only story. I'll bet there's more, if not in the War Memorial, in the State Library, in local historical society, in India. These stories are there to be told.
You have spent a good amount of time in terms of not just writing the publication, but sharing it with everybody. And in that process of sharing, you have to hand on the baton, and then people need to come along, and then not just to have one book, but there should be more books and more pieces of work to be done and added to the research in terms of stories and a bit more information. Where do you see this going from here? After 13 years post-publication, what's your experience and what do you think should happen and is happening?
Okay. As I said earlier on, Dev, historians aren't precious about holding on to things. They like to share. And I'm not going to do another book on this. So if it's going to be done, and more needs to be done, it needs to be done by somebody else and somebody younger, preferably somebody Indian, because they need that cultural connection in order to make the most of it. I mean, if you like, I don't speak any Indian language at all. So why would you trust me to tell the stories, and why would you trust me to tell you the stories that I found? But if somebody, and I have some names of young scholars who can do it, they need the wherewithal, they need the funding, they need the opportunity. Because I'm sure the evidence is out there, the material is out there, but it needs that magic conjunction of somebody who's got the skills, who's got the interest, the motivation, who's got the funding, who's got a secure job and a research grant, and who's got the ability to comprehend that stuff. And they don't come along every 5 minutes. But I know there are people who could do that, and they need the encouragement and they need the means to do it. And I dearly hope somebody will come along. There are other books been written since I published mine, at least 2 books, one in Britain, one in India, and that's great. But I think more needs to be done to find new evidence and not just retell the same stuff.
And writing history is rather than it's not an art, as in you have to tell, it's a factual-based stories, and you have to join the dots in so many factions and across geographies and across times. And you have traveled across the continents to identify evidence and trying to narrate the story in a chronographic fashion. What was your biggest moment of plateau, where you got stuck and said, nothing is happening here? Where did you feel that I should drop the idea?
Oh, I never thought I should drop it. No. Every time I used to go to the Department of Foreign Affairs about every 3-5 years, because they have this desk officer. They have a desk officer for India, and every time the desk officer changed, I went to the new one and said, "Hey, here's a good idea," and they all said, "That's a very good idea," but they never gave me any money, so I never gave up on the idea. And the moment I became a research professor in 2013, where I could do what I liked and they gave me money to do it, I knew that then I could make it. And sure enough, 2 years later, the book came out. So, but I tell you, the magic moments in the process. The first one, or not in order, but the first I recall is going to Patiala. And I went to Patiala for the weekend. I stayed in the Maharaja's Palace. They named my wife for Prince Charles left here. And he brought out his family album. And there in this document, that, honestly, I only know of one other person who's seen it. And there were images, and I showed you some of them, that told the Patiala story. The Patiala story had never been told to Gallipoli. It's not mentioned in the British official history, it's not mentioned in the Australian official history. But it happened. The other one was when I went to Nepal, and I went to the Gurkha Museum, which is in Pokhara, and I discovered, no surprise, I also went to the Gurkha Museum in Winchester in Britain, because there's Gurkhas everywhere, and I found the same attitude. The Gurkhas are proud of their history, and they make their history apparent. You know, they deliver stuff, they give you stuff, they want you to use it. And in both of those two places, they both got libraries, these museums, and in both places they gave me a cup of tea while I was working, and I thought, that's good. And the third thing, and I'll only give you three, the third thing is that I have a very close friend and colleague in New Delhi called Rana China. He's Sikh, he's got a military background, an Air Force background, and Rana was the man who found most of those photographs, because Rana went to the 10th Mechanized Battalion and said, hey, have you got anything from 1915? And the 10th Mechanized Battalion said, oh yeah, we've got a scrapbook somewhere. Where's that photograph album? And they brought out an album of photographs that had never before been seen. And Rana, because historians are generous with each other, Rana gave me all of those photographs and said, use them. And I've been putting them everywhere for 15 years. So there's three examples where generosity towards people asking questions actually gets you good history.
Mm-hmm. In conclusion, I think you told me that you will write another book on this if you have 100 stories.
Yes, 100 stories.
100 stories. Yeah. So what's your message to everybody here who have family members and extended friends who might have some, scrapbooks or stories? Yep. What's your message? How to find them and how can we find more stories?
Yeah. Well, it's not easy because, and you know this better than I do, keeping family papers in India is not easy, especially if you lived in the Punjab in around 1947, because if you were going to save yourself, you wouldn't necessarily save the box of papers. And Indian families, you know this, are really quite private. If I knocked on the door of any house in the Punjab and said, hello, I'm from Australia, I'd like you to tell me your secrets, well, the first thing is they wouldn't necessarily understand a word I said. If they gave me things, I couldn't do it. So I'm not minimizing the difficulty, but somebody should do it. Somebody who's got a rapport, a relationship with the community. And again, I know people who could do this. It's not easy because if the material's out there, you've got to find the people. I don't know, an advert in the Times of India, I don't know. It'll go through networks, it'll go through communities, and it will be by communities because, the Sikh network, well-developed, motivated, one, that's the easy bit. But even the easy bit, we still haven't done it yet. So networks, so talking to other people, talking to families, saying to them, what did your grandfather do in the First World War? Chances are he didn't join the army, but some of them might, some of them would have. So somebody needs to do it. Getting the Gurkha stories and the Pakistani stories, I'm not optimistic at all. I don't know how that could happen. But somebody should do it. And I think young people, the next generation, need to do it. And I think it has to be an Indian. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or an Indian Australian. Yeah. Yep.
Stanley, I'm from Pakistan.
Oh, hello.
Hey.
Great.
Yeah. I probably will work on it.
Good man.
I have already done before coming here.
Yeah.
I've asked many old people in the 1780s. I got some information on
Oh, good on you. Well, we must swap.
Yeah.
And the Pakistan Defence Attaché in Canberra, in 2014, I thought Christmas had come because they said, come to lunch. And it turned out the defence advisor had served in what is now the 1st Heavy Artillery Regiment, which is descended from the 7th Mountain Artillery Brigade, and he was very keen to help. And then he got transferred, and I haven't heard from him since. So, but the point is, somebody in the Pakistan Army was interested, and maybe there's more. Oh, in fact, I have people in Pakistan who are interested. So I'd be happy to chat. Thank you.
He won't be transferred.
Oh, good. Excellent. Okay.
Any other questions?
So, thank you, Mr. Stanley, Professor Stanley, sorry. It was really nice watching all those slides and beautiful pictures you do. I got a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Certainly.
I was writing up as you were going through the things.
Good.
And thank you, Dave, for organizing such a beautiful event. Thank you, I really appreciate it. So what actually inspired you? Like I was thinking, the research on Indian soldiers at Gallipoli. And what surprised you most during your work?
Oh, I can answer the second one first. Call me Peter. I can answer the second one first. What surprised me most was the relationship that developed. Because I read that diary, that memoir, So I kind of knew that there was a relationship, but I was surprised by the number of references I found among a deeply racist force that praised Indian soldiers for their courage, their resilience, their dedication, their professionalism. That's what surprised me. And then I realized that it wasn't just one or two examples. I was actually correct in surmising that. And what started me on it was that I went to India when I was 30, my first big overseas trip. And, I went to India because I wrote a book as a teenager called Queen Victoria's Little Wars, which was a history of the Indian Army in the 19th century. And I kind of fell in love with the Indian Army. And then I realized when I started work at the War Memorial that I could tell Indian stories that had an Australian dimension. And although I wasn't able to do it for a very long time, eventually I did.